Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you, everyone. I'm super excited for today. Thank you for joining us. So this conversation is something that started actually back in, I think, July now. We had the first webinar on August 11th, looking at schools and their role that they can play in youth homelessness and prevention. And this also builds off a blog that you can check out on the Homeless Hub called Moving Beyond Motivation, Learnings from 3 School Partnerships. Stories, I forget the whole name. It's very long, but it's a really great conversation with some of our panelists today, talking about some of the lessons they've learned in doing this work. And I've been lucky enough to be involved and will be moderating today. Maybe we can go to the next slide, Lindsay. So before we get started, we just wanted to see who was joining us today so that we can know that for the future, and it's just interesting to see who is involved. So a poll should come up and you should be able to answer it. And I'm technologically not super, so I'm just gonna.
The poll just had a glitch, so it actually it's not going to work. So what we'll ask people to do is in the chat box, just let us know what type of work you do, what industry you're coming from. So if you're coming from the education system, the homelessness system, youth services, maybe you're in funding or policy, or maybe you're involved in research or a student, we'd love to know where you're coming from.
Great. Yeah, share in the chat where you're coming from, where you're working. And so we'll have some questions from the panelists today, and then we're going to try to have a pretty robust Q&A period. So if there are things throughout that you're wondering about, that you want to ask about, we'll have time for that at the end. So moving forward, I would just like to give everyone the opportunity to introduce themselves and what their role is around this issue in, a couple minutes. I won't rush you, but maybe we'll start with Monique.
So bonjour, Gigi Benang on a Goshen and Quen Dishnakas, Guy Makwa Dodam, Yishingaming in Doshenba. My English name is Monique Valli, and I am the Executive Director for Nawasa Kandaswin Tag here in Hamilton. We have the NAWI program, which stands for Native Youth Advancement with Education Hamilton, that provides culturally relevant supports for Indigenous students and their families in 5 secondary and elementary schools in Hamilton. And we work closely with our school board partners. Miigwech.
Thanks, Monique. Clovis.
Hi, everyone. My name is Clovis Grant, and I'm the CEO for 360 Kids, which is an organization that provides services for homeless and at-risk youth in York region, which is north of Toronto. And we've been privileged to be a backbone organization for a youth prevention housing stabilization project, and where we bring together the community to address issues of homelessness prevention. And we've been really blessed to have the support of the York Region District School Board, as well as the Catholic District School Board, to actually do this work in working more from an upstream prevention, early intervention lens. And so we're excited for the work that we can do together with those different education providers.
Thanks, Clovis. Yvonne?
Thank you. My name is Yvonne Kelly, and I am a community and partnership developer with the York Region District School Board. And my background is in social work, community development, and social planning. And our role as community and partnership developers is to really assist our schools in accessing and becoming integrally involved with the other support systems outside of our system to be able to provide better opportunities for students and families, and also to work with those community partners to really build strong and nurturing partnerships so that we can address issues that arise as they arise, and hopefully before they become bigger concerns in our community. I was formerly the WIRE DSB liaison for the Upstream project in York Region, which was offered by Raising the Roof, and we were a pilot for 2 high school prevention programs, youth homelessness prevention programs. And right now I'm also a member of the York Region Youth Strategy, collective impact project that Clovis mentioned to prevent youth homelessness.
Thanks, Yvonne. Charlotte.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Smith, and I'm a Master's of Sociology student at Carleton University with lived experience of homelessness. My thesis research took place over 3 years of participatory work with homeless young people. And I always introduce myself as a peer with lived experience and offer that we can stay in touch. And what's that turned into is kind of like this organic community of young people, adults, and allies with lived experience of homelessness who are all working together on issues around advocacy. And, since COVID, we've been doing like emergency support for young people and that kind of thing. I just want to briefly tell you about my research findings. So I interviewed more than 30 young people between the ages of 17 and 23 about their school-based experiences before, during, and after their homelessness. What I found is that young people are often punished for the symptoms of their homelessness in schools, example being suspended for missing too many classes or ridiculed for falling asleep at their desk. I found that youth are often pushed out of schools who seemingly don't want to deal with the side effects of housing precarity and homelessness in students. And how I try to incorporate this knowledge into my own work in the community is I try to not punish, I try to not recreate the same problems that I'm identifying that youth are telling me about in my own work. So I try to not punish them as I'm working with them, which we can all easily do by accident, right? So for example, if there are young people wanting to participate who really struggle with reliability, like, consistently being able to show up, that doesn't mean they lose out on opportunities. I found that the most valuable thing that young people are telling me about is the prevalence of champion teachers, which are basically individual teachers who are going above and beyond their job to provide emotional, sometimes financial support to young people, even sometimes taking young people in and providing them with emergency shelter. And they're doing this without the support of their institutions and obviously potentially risking their jobs in order to help. I try to emulate this finding by helping youth in any way possible. And when I can't help them, which is very often, trying to connect them with somebody who can. I found that schools, young people are telling me schools aren't meaningfully connected to the supports in their immediate community. So they're often handed a phone number to a service. And what they're telling me is that they actually want somebody to sort of hold their hand and go to that service with them, make sure that they actually access that service and they know how to deal with the administrative aspects of that. I found that guidance counselors are the most common resource deployed for homeless youth in schools, but unfortunately these people don't have specialized training in issues around homelessness. So for example, they'll often give youth a list of rental properties they've found online, which is a nice idea, but that of course we know many landlords don't want to rent to young people, especially when that youth looks unaccompanied and unsupported by an adult. So what they really would like is that guidance counselor or professional to advocate for them with these landlords. The biggest finding of this research was that youth homelessness isn't being talked about in schools, and that when it is, it's being talked about as something that happens to older people or people in other countries. Which means, so this finding is my biggest motivation to want to work with young people in schools. Because number one, young people believe that education on youth homelessness could have ensured that they knew it was something that could have happened to them. Many don't until they become homeless. And then when they do end up on the streets, they learn how to cope with that situation from other youth or adults who are also struggling with this issue. They told me that education could have helped lessen the stigma that they faced in educational institutions, as well as it could have helped them know what to do when it happened to them, which resources to access, as well as how to help their peers who were facing housing instability. Importantly, young people stress that education on youth homelessness should be led by those with lived experience and preferably youth-led, so that it's relatable and meaningful to them. Several of them pointed to drug prevention education as an example of education that is ineffective and stigmatizing in itself, because it implies that youth can just say no to substance use rather than acknowledging that they might have very good reasons to be engaging in substance use, such as past and ongoing trauma. Since I don't have the tools right now to help create a youth-led education on homelessness in elementary and high schools, I found an alternate route to mobilizing the knowledge of this research, which is that young people, A, want to finish high school, and we know many don't when they're struggling with housing instability, and 2, many have dreams to go on to post-secondary education, which led to my collaboration with Carleton University on the Chicken and Boots Scholarship, which supports young people who want to enter university, and also allows us to engage in the whole community in these kind of conversations and see how we can make other partnerships, such as with Operation Come Home, a youth drop-in that runs a high school credit program, and how we kind of streamline and coordinate these services to get more youth into post-secondary education.
Thanks, Charlotte. Maybe you've already started getting at this, but the first question I want to ask, and we can go on to the next slide, is can you think of an example, knowing that sometimes this isn't an issue that's being seen as important in schools, of when you've had to demonstrate the importance of this issue or make the case for this within schools? And maybe we'll start with Clovis.
Thank you for that. And Charlotte, thank you so much for all that you just said. Some of it I'm going to reflect on here because I referenced earlier about the youth strategy work that we've been engaged in. And so in response to the question, a couple of things come to mind for me. One, it goes back to the youth strategy work. And I remember sitting in one of our meetings and hearing from a young person who was homeless, and now she's actually part of the youth steering committee for this project. And I remember her talking about how great it would have been if her school was aware of some of the challenges that she was experiencing, and if there was a way to have connected with her earlier, intervening with her family, because there are some family dynamics that she felt like if there could have been an earlier connection to somebody, some kind of support, she would not have ended up having to go to a shelter. So I think about that story a lot, and how many other young people who are really struggling, who just need that connection. And the school is, in her case, she said if the school would have been more aware and supportive, it would have really made a difference for her. So she was a strong advocate for that. A second example I just wanted to flag was in our partnership with the York School Board, we do different presentations, whether it be on homelessness itself or in some instances related issues like human trafficking. And I recall a presentation that was done, and one of the students who heard the presentation spoke to one of the service providers and said, you know, I think one of my friends may be getting groomed, because we went through and talked about what the grooming process looked like. And her friend didn't come with her, but she came on behalf of her friend and said, what you've told me reminds me of what I'm hearing from my friend. And so we were able to actually encourage her to bring her friend, and the three of them, the counselor, the staff member, the friend, and this young lady, was able to actually have a dialogue about human trafficking, the dangers and the challenges that would ensue. And here is a situation where a young person, a young woman, was prevented from actually ending up along those pathways. And so that was a strong reminder to me about the importance of having these conversations with the school, because there are so many things that young people can get involved in, but being able to create awareness about these very important social issues, that for me is a way that has been very helpful in demonstrating that this is the kind of stuff that we need to be sharing about, and equipping the schools as well as the students with the information that they need to avoid having to intervene downstream. And so doing a lot of that awareness and prevention work up front really, really makes a difference in the lives of our young people.
Absolutely. Yvonne, did you want to follow up on that?
Sure. Would love to build on what both Clovis and Charlotte had to say, because I think I'll probably speak a little bit more to like why it is such a hard thing to make a case for within a school system. And I completely concur with Charlotte in terms of the things that we do wittingly or unwittingly within a sector to contribute to the push out of students. And I intentionally call it that because young people don't want to drop out of school, and it really implies that it's a personal choice, that they just didn't choose to be in school any longer, when we know that there's always a lot of factors. And I know Clovis and I are doing so many of the same things together. We'll probably have similar kind of anecdotes and stories. But I will say that the year leading up to the Upstream project, which was funded by Raising the Roof, and it was a kind of a piloting of a Geelong project, which came from Australia, working in high schools or in intermediate to identify students who are vulnerable for homelessness, and so there could be an intervention early on. And so that was a never-ending cycle of trying to demonstrate that this work was necessary in our schools. So I can't even point to one example. It's more like it was a legacy of trying to demonstrate. The truth about schools, though, even though there's been a significant movement in the past 10 years, core business remains to be academic and education focused, and it's not always that comprehensive. So even though student well-being has taken its well-deserved place on the mantle of education, and mental health has become a primary focus in recent years, it's still not easy to make a case for supports in our schools that come from outside. I always think about just how difficult it was even trying to get after school programs, which is kind of like the most prevention. It's very, after schools programs have been around for years, and yet even getting those indoor schools was a real slog, because number one, is it needed? Number two, how much extra work is it going to cause for us? So a lot of concerns. And other programs that have had so much success in reaching and meeting with our students directly was the youth outreach workers. But it took time for staff to trust that this work happening in our schools was critical. And schools who knew that many of their students were already at risk for homelessness or other life situations that were not positive were often open to this, but not always. So I think the role of ongoing education, as Clovis has iterated, staff, administrators, superintendents, student support services about the issue and the factors that lead to it, which we can either be a contributing factor to, or we can be part of the solution in trying to address those factors. And I think the other piece is just bringing it to light in a region like York Region, where people think that poverty and homelessness is something that doesn't happen here. We have to continue to let people know it does. We need to continue to do the workshops, the guest speakers, bringing people in from the agencies, and just really, really making that case. It would seem like it shouldn't be necessary to make the case for something that's obviously so real, but it's making the case for the reality of the issue, the need for schools to work with outside agencies, and the culture shift that we need to create within our own systems to recognize when we are doing things that can actually contribute to it as well.
Absolutely. Charlotte, I'm going to go back to you. I know you talked a lot about your research. Can you think of an example of this particular work that you're doing?
I mean, I think we're always having to demonstrate that this work is important. As a peer researcher, I have to continuously demonstrate that what I'm doing is actually research in the ways that I'm collaborating with youth in the community, and that we do, like, for example, presentations at Carleton University, things like that. We've done, Yvonne, you just mentioned, that education has like a very academic focus and business focus a lot of times. Like, young people in research are telling me that they wanted to learn life skills, that they want to learn, things like taxes, things that will reduce barriers to employment, like driver's licenses, right? So through the research that I've done, for example, we've began now to begin helping young people get their driver's ed, because we received a donation for that. And even having, academics question me, saying things like, well, how are homeless youth ever going to afford cars anyways? It's like you constantly have to defend that these young people are deserving of opportunities, and that it's not the fact that they haven't been able to succeed in schools or in various different life ways is not a sign of their lack of effort or their lack of desire to. It's just that all of these structural issues, and they're just genuine lack of opportunity and lack of necessary supports. So yeah, it's just a constantly having to defend, and like you both just said, people like to imagine that these issues aren't happening in their schools. And you know, setting up the Chicken and Boots bursary at Carleton University has really opened up the administration's eyes to the prevalence of housing and homelessness, on housing instability and homelessness on campus. And they were really shocked and overwhelmed at how many applicants they got. Similarly, when the youth and I are presenting in classrooms at Carleton, we've had several students come up to us and disclose their homelessness after that. So it just shows the importance of having these conversations and normalizing this topic and allowing people to speak about these issues and stop rendering it invisible.
Thanks. And Monique?
Well, I would echo the comments from my co-panelists and thank them for offering those things out to us. I think that we are constantly having to defend and educate and bring awareness for these services and programs to be in schools. And I think that's for many reasons, the construct of the schools, but also there's constantly changing administrators, principals, educators in the system. And it's, you know, it's part of our role to constantly provide that awareness to them. So I'm going to share with you a story that I experienced in some of the work. The Nawe program is a partnership with the school boards. And so when we're looking to hire folks into the program, we do that together in a collaborative way. We work with either the Indigenous liaison from the board or a vice principal in the school community. We were just expanding into a new school, and we were conducting interviews during the day. And during our break, the vice principal asked me, can you help me to understand why Indigenous students need their own program in schools? We have our guidance counselors, our EAs, our social workers, all those folks that we've already heard about in the schools. We have curriculum that's changing to include Indigenous knowledge. So why can't the students access those supports that are already available and in place for them? So I could have spent the remainder of that afternoon discussing the Indian Act, residential schools, and the intergenerational trauma that our families and students experience and continue to experience. But during that day, the vice principal had shared something with me that I thought made a lot of sense. She was speaking to me about the work that she did with her Greek heritage and how proud she was that she was a coordinator of this heritage festival. So I posed a question back to her and I asked her, can you explain to me how you would feel if I were to take over your role as the organizer for the Greek festival? And she kind of looked at me like in a puzzled way and, you know, couldn't really understand what I was getting at. And so I said, you know, I can read all about your culture in books, and I love Greek food. It's one of my favorite foods to have, and I'm sure I could learn some of the Greek language and we'd have a great festival. I'm great at coordinating, you know, we could dance and enjoy the music, you know, at the festival. And she looked at me quite stunned and she said, well, but it's not just about our food and our, you know, the music. It's much more than that. It's deeper. It's about the pride that we have in our homeland, in our heritage, in our culture, and the relationships that are important in our community, but also the familial relationships that you won't be able to understand and convey. And so then I asked her, can you now relate that to the Indigenous students and families who are entering a system that is really operated from a colonial context? And can you understand how it would be really important for Indigenous students to have folks working in the school who understand their worldview, who understand their histories, their culture, and also the trauma that they have experienced and faced? And that was really was a light bulb moment, an aha moment for her. And And so I think that we just need to continue to have those conversations. And that conversation actually set the stage for us to have further conversations where we could discuss the positive and successful outcomes and impacts of the programs that were happening in other schools. And I really think it's that relational piece that's so important when we're working alongside our school partners.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for sharing. And actually, Monique, I think that that shifts us into our next question quite well. One thing that we noticed when we've been talking to you all, and I've noticed elsewhere when we're thinking of schools and building strong relationships, is that time is something that is really important to pay attention to, and it's important to take time to build these collaborations and to have these conversations around shared understandings. So I was wondering if you could each also share an experience or an anecdote thinking about time in the context of this work, and maybe we'll start with Yvonne this time.
Thanks, Jayne. Yeah, I think as we were talking and leading up to this webinar, I think that was certainly a theme that came out loud and clear. And I think, I'm fortunate because I work in a role that isn't common in school boards, which is community and partnership, also within the Inclusive School and Community Services Department, where it's been taken very seriously that students need to see themselves reflected in our schools, and if that can't be something that's complete and comprehensive, that we at least have staff that can work, that can reach out and kind of reflect the reality of a lot of our students, whether that's faith-based, culturally based. And in my role, I work as someone who does work on poverty, which is also one of the reasons that I'm involved in this work as well. And I have always felt as a community development person, time and the process of building those relationships is probably the most critical thing. But it's also critical who's in the roles and who is able to have an understanding and appreciation and really help students understand that someone is in this position that can actually understand a bit more about what they're going through and meet them where they're at. So when I started at the board about 10 years ago, I'll never forget the first time I met staff at what was then Pathways and is now 360 at their home base site, and just seeing the incredible work they were doing and the way they were involved with young people. And so over the years, it's been kind of a goal or a project of mine to ensure that the work that is being done in the community to support our young people can actually be more embedded in our schools. And I've had a lot of experiences of promoting, talking about, getting a pushback, getting, just not as much of an understanding of why this is so incredibly important in our schools. And so if I'd have said, I'm going to give myself 2 years and we'll see where we're at, I probably would have stopped because it has taken so much more time. And then someone else mentioned this too. I think it was Monique, that it's the school boards and the systems themselves are set up where people come and go very regularly. So you might have an administrator in a school for 4 years. That's probably the most. Teachers often stay longer, but people in roles and positions of responsibility and leadership are shifting all the time. So you have to constantly kind of be following those that you've built a good relationship with to find out how to leverage their positionality and their influence in ways that can help advance the work. But you also just have to keep getting to know new people. And so I would say that, really it was probably year 6 or 7 for me. That was when we started working on the Raising the Roof project, the Geelong project. And we were seeing that there was some interest, that there was some uptake in terms of trying to implement a pilot project. But because everything seems to be so focused on outcomes, short and midterm outcomes, it was still hard to help people understand there's importance in this work that's going to take place over a longer period of time, and you're not going to see everything in the immediate. And the other piece I already mentioned is that our region is one where you don't see visible signs of homelessness, youth or otherwise. And we've had conversations about poverty and homelessness and housing insecurity for over 10 or 12 years, where we've had leaders in our system, but also in our communities, that that's not a problem that we experience here. So it's taken time, it's taken building those relationships, and a growing recognition of the needs, and also just building positive relationships with staff over many years as they experience referring kids to the iGrad program or to the Night Stop program. And the other piece, over time, you identify some of these champions, and then eventually some of them decide to stand out and do something for you. So Clovis can speak about how important it was for our Director of Education to go on the night challenge, which was spending the night as a young person would on the streets of York Region. And out of that situation came someone who hadn't been a champion before, but certainly was now. So I think we really just need to, it's on us, because the restraints are, people want to see the results now, and they want to see action, and they want to see positivity, but they aren't really often committed to the amount of time that it takes. But it's absolutely necessary. And I'm losing my voice, so I'll finish there.
Thank you, Yvonne. And Charlotte, maybe we'll move on to you next.
Yeah, time is so important, especially when you are working with young people with lived experience of homelessness. Many of them I met during research at first, and we were working together in an official research capacity with just a few of them on a youth advisory, but there was lots of issues with that. The biggest one being a lack of trust between us. Being a peer does help me build rapport initially quickly, but young people who've experienced homelessness require substantial amounts of time investment to actually build trust, because they've often been experienced extreme forms of abuse, neglect, and betrayal at the hands of adults. So it's been, more than 2.5 years working with some of them, and now, we're getting to the point where they feel comfortable to tell me when they're feeling uncomfortable. Right, and that's and I'm really committed to youth-led education on youth homelessness in schools as a part of prevention, because that's what young people are telling me they want and need, and that's what they're saying that's what would have helped them. But yeah, it's expensive and it's time-consuming, because you can't rush these kind of things. You can't fit that kind of work and that kind of working trust into a 6-month funded project. You just can't. So another finding from my research is that young people often feel like the people who are helping them, like they're a burden to them, even the professionals that are working with them, and that person might only be there for a paycheck. And I think that if young people have this rational worry, then you can't really demonstrate to them that you're not only there for a paycheck unless you're willing to engage with them in ways that are not explicitly tied to your predefined confines of your professional positionality. So I have to go outside of the research box and make these connections, and I have to be committed to being in it for the long haul. Similarly, in establishing the Chicken and Boots Bursary, there's been moments where in one instant a partnership is created. For example, the President Bacon at Carleton University, he's been very open about his substance use disorder and mental health issues. And so after speaking on a panel with him about that and hearing that, and I was so appreciative and like overwhelmed that he had spoken about this, I had the guts to ask him about establishing the bursary, and right away he said yes, he would support that. And like Yvonne's saying, in other times, there are up and coming champions of this work who I've been working with for 2 years, and people have told me I'm wasting my time, but it's never a waste of time to, one, be entering these conversations and bringing awareness, two, be trying to make connections with people, because you never know how and when they'll come into play. There's one member of the community who's about to become a champion for the Chicken and Boots Bursary who's also building apartment towers. And when I asked this person a year ago, when I first heard they were going to build these buildings, like, well, how many are going to be for low income or affordable? I don't like to use that word because we don't know what it means. What is affordable? But he said, well, none. And then recently at a meeting about the bursary and in speaking with the youth, he's committed to actually incorporating affordable housing. But what that lets us do is it lets us also mobilize more of that research, more of that data from the research in helping him. How do we make this building successful? How do we make it not just a recreation of community housing or other problematic issues with trying to get young people housed? How can we actually support them and make this a successful endeavor?
Thanks, Charlotte. Monique?
I think I would, again, echo my co-panelist here, but I think one of the important things from our worldview is that a relationship really needs to be, it needs to be forged on all school levels, but it needs to be grounded in reciprocity and equity. So we really need to search for allies within the school system, within that school community, somebody who wants to work alongside you, someone who really believes in your project and your cause. And it takes time to do those things, right? So I recall back to an art teacher that was in one of the very first secondary schools that we had started operating the Nawe program in. And she was really, really interested and committed in learning and educating herself and really wanted to be part of the project. And she wanted to also be able to offer those opportunities for students to learn about Indigenous art and music in all forms in their classroom. And so she worked very closely with our youth advisors to provide that knowledge for her students. And she encouraged the other educators, her peers that she was working with, to engage with the youth advisors. At this time, things were very, very new, and this wasn't the way things were traditionally rolling out in schools. So it was a genuine relationship that was built with that educator, the youth advisors, and the youth. She became such a wonderful ally with us. And she in turn didn't just say, you know, wonderful, I have this opportunity where folks can come and provide this information to us, and I can take this knowledge and teachings and thank you. But she actually gave back. So it was a reciprocal relationship, and she gave back by she became one of our best advocates. She would advocate for our students, she would advocate for the program within the school, and her voice with her colleagues went such a long way to helping us further our relationships. So I think that's a really good example of you know, you need to find your allies in all different places within the system and build those strong ways of understanding one another.
Thank you. And Clovis, your thoughts on this question?
Oh gee, it's hard to go last on some of these questions because I've got so many smart people who've gone ahead of me. I'll echo a few comments. One, having someone like Yvonne, I can't speak enough about the work she does on the inside to help support our work. So those champions that you're talking about, Monique, for sure, having someone like Yvonne who believes in the work that is done in the community and how that can actually add to the successes of the students goes without saying. I think secondly, time is required to demonstrate that it can work, because yes, there is apprehension that who are these people, and the school generally tries to protect the students, and rightly so, or depends on your views on that, but we're trying to ensure that whatever services are for the best interest of the students. So time is required, and I think over time we've demonstrated as an organization that we can deliver successes to our kids. As an example, Yvonne referenced the iGrad program, which is a school program. It's now recognized as a classroom, a school within our drop-in. And over the last 4 years since we've had it, we've seen about 50 young people actually get their high school diploma. So that has taken time, but it has shown that it can work, that young people can graduate. Young people want to go to school. It's just their circumstances has made it difficult. And if we reduce the barriers, we've demonstrated over time that through that collaboration, having the school board putting that and paying for that teacher in the drop-in, we've seen amazing successes. And in fact, we're looking at how can we replicate that model, because we've seen that it can actually work. And so you do require time for that to happen. I can be, somebody who wants to see results right away myself. And I learned even this summer through our youth strategy work that it does take time for even the school departments to connect with each other. And we've talked earlier about the youth strategy work, and we have a willing set of about 30 providers and a group of young people who are willing partners to see more prevention work happening, and that's amazing. We've got some funding to be a backbone to do this. That's amazing. We've got a school board who wants to do this. Like, we've got the trifecta right there happening, but yet at the same time, we saw, even though we were seeing some elements of success, I remember the superintendent who from the school board who sits on this this committee and really dedicated to this work. She said it would be really, really important for different school departments to actually also be aware of the work that we're doing. And I thought that was actually really, really smart, because I thought, you know what, let's get a pilot project going and let's, show that it can be done. And she wisely said, okay, she involved in student success, is all over this project. We've got Yvonne, who's all over it. But then we brought in research because there was a research project that was done to every student counts to see the demographics of the students. So research was brought in. We thought about the summer, and there's a gap there. So brought in the person who's in charge of the summer program just to talk about, are there things that we can do to help mitigate some of those gaps. And we also talked about social work and the importance of engaging social work, because that was a lesson we learned when we did the upstream work. So what I was seeing was, not only is it important to build a relationship with the community, but even within the school itself. Even though you may have a champion over here, you need champions over here, champions over here, and champions over here. And when the entire school community is actually behind the project, it makes it easier to sustain it versus just one group or one person, because if that person leaves, then the project falls apart. But if it's actually part of the entire way of thinking and doing within the board, and we've shown over time that we can actually work together to achieve successes for the students, then I think that lends itself well to further collaboration, because we've demonstrated that working together is actually better than working independently. So not only the external, but also the internal relationships need to happen, and that takes time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. I feel like each of these questions could be a whole panel, but I wanted to ask a question about something that comes up again and again in talking about this work. And I know we've chatted about this a bit. Many people talk about the fear of doing something wrong when working in schools, or shying away from anything that might be seen as risky or risk involved. And I'm wondering if each of you could share an example of maybe speaking to this or thinking of something that didn't go as you intended it would, and how you moved on from that in these situations. And Charlotte.
Yeah, sorry. I think sometimes when I wrote my answers to these questions, I don't know which questions I was reading because they don't necessarily specifically answer it. But as somebody with lived experience who continues to struggle with substance use disorder and dodgy mental health, I'm personally afraid of working in schools because I'm afraid of being seen as a bad influence or a bad apple. And that goes all the way back to, when I got kicked out and when my friends and their parents and others stepped back from me and didn't want me around anymore, or even before that, when my mental health was declining and I started cutting my arm, being told by adults around me like they didn't want me around younger children because they would see the cuts and want to start cutting. I'm worried about things like my criminal record being brought up. I'm worried about things like relapse. But in a weird way, me being worried about these things and stepping back from this important work is is kind of adding to that stigma and adding to that idea that people who have experienced homelessness or criminalization or who use drugs are bad or dangerous, right? So I really need to, I think, take that on. And primarily what I'm worried about besides that is how to support young people in this role. How do I support young people who want to give this education in schools? To give an example of a time when this didn't go well was, you know, especially in the early stages of formal research, when I had just started out, you know, putting young people in positions that they weren't ready for, you know, having them tell me after presentations that, hey, I wasn't, you know, like that was not the audience that I wanted to share my story with. I wanted to share it with this instead, or that I didn't have enough meetings to prepare for that, you know, and it always returned to the grant, you know, it was always like, well, there wasn't enough money for extra meetings or this and that. So since I've stepped up, you know, I'm not, you know, I still participate in the formal research, but in my collaborative work with young people, we can have unlimited meetings to prepare for engagements, and I can better support them in whatever way. And the nice thing about doing it informally like this is we have the control to cancel, change things at last minute, and basically do whatever it takes to support the young people in the work that they want to do, and not be beholden to a research output that's been stated in a proposal, or rigid confines around timing or things like that.
Thank you. Monique, maybe we'll move on to you.
Sure. I would just, I mean, I think we're all learning as we move through this process. There's no kind of blueprint for this. I think we're all going to have mishaps and mistakes as we continue to learn and grow together. And I think the really important thing is that we're coming from a place of good intention. I think the system is a complicated web of hierarchy. And, you know, after all these years working alongside school communities, I still am not sure that I fully understand the culture in schools. And I think that's partly because I hold a very different worldview. And I think if I think of an example of a time things didn't go as we had intended, I can recall when one of our youth advisors was going into a classroom to speak around hair and teachings around hair and the importance of that connection and what that means for some Indigenous nations around our connection to our history, our ancestors. And I think some folks took that teaching in a wrong way and thought, you know, that we were trying to tell students that they couldn't braid their hair. And so I think it took us some time to kind of just step back and maybe have some more, it was more opportunity for education within the schools, with the educators, you know, going to staff meetings and really kind of bridging those pieces of understanding together. And so I don't think there's anything that you can't come back from. I think you certainly can. And it's going to go back to the time that we take to really be invested in what's happening in the schools with the youth.
Thank you. Clovis, I won't make you go last again.
Reduce my trauma. We've talked a bit about the upstream work, and I just wanted to reference that because that was one of our early examples of strong connection with the school, and just being able to get the opportunity to actually do this survey in the schools was amazing. And in our zeal to just get this project running, because as Yvonne said, it was many years, or maybe not many, but a number of years in developing just to get to the place where we can actually roll out a survey to identify young people who may be at risk. And in our zeal, we ended up working with 3 schools, and roughly close to 2,000 young people went through that survey. Now, very ambitious, because really part of the survey was to identify people who were at risk, young people who were at risk, and then wrap services around them. So you think about having your regular caseloads, and now you've just opened the Pandora's box of potentially 2,000 people who you can now add to your caseload. Whether it was really wise on our part or not, but that was learning that it really is important that when you do this, to do it in a manageable way, because in a sense, we almost could have bitten off too much and then not being able to continue with the school because we unearthed need, but then we weren't actually able to meet those needs. So it was learning, as Charlotte had said, but yet it was a partnership. The school actually knew some of these students. It wasn't all 2,000, by the way, that were in need, but we were able to triage and support those most in need, and a number of them were actually known by the school, and the school was able to support them. And that was also a second part of the learning. We should have involved social work at the beginning, because social work actually knew some of these students, and so the handoff actually happened after. But if social work was involved at the beginning, then we could have probably managed that differently. So now, as we're doing this prevention work, guess what? Social work is involved very early. They're involved right now, working with us to develop these interventions. And so the learning, the mistakes do help with the learning going forward, and we were able to implement changes as a result of what seemed to have been a mistake or doing something wrong, when in fact I see it as a learning opportunity.
Yvonne?
So I knew this was going to happen. So I think Clovis and I have the same examples in some cases, and that's great. I think I find myself wanting to comment more on and build on what others have said, like Monique and Charlotte this last time around. But I mean, I think when it comes to a culture of risk and a culture of shying away from things that could go wrong, I feel like our schools are pretty embedded in that fear. And I actually think, because I see more kind of concern about liability, that it has actually increased the stakes and made sometimes it a little more difficult to do things. So I'm thankful that the work that we did in the last 5 or 6 years around upstream happened when it did, because there's been a foot in the door to be able to say, this work is important. We've got more allies, because if we were just starting now, I think we'd be in a different place, because the fear of risk and liability, even though we know the needs, we're understanding more the needs of students. We understand how much of an issue mental health is. We understand the high risk that our LGBTQ students face in terms of homelessness as well as other challenges. So even at a time when we understand all these needs and that our role is so huge, it's also paralleled by this other increasing concern about things that could go wrong. So I was going to speak a little bit to the upstream project. I'll probably still say a little bit about that in terms of my example. I think the whole thing was a bit of a risk, and it fits with what we're talking about in terms of time, and also just having to meet those ridiculous funding deadlines. So as much as we all can appreciate that relationships and time are critical, everyone talks about it, everybody knows it, but it's never embedded in the work that we get to do. So we aren't always taking the time to get to know people, and maybe that's why the work doesn't go as far as it could, because every person you invest time in has other folks that will be brought along to support the work. But as we talk about in the schools, teaching to the test, I feel like sometimes we're racing just to make sure we're fitting all those funding requirements. And in the case of upstream 3 or 4 years ago, so much time had been lost in terms of we weren't able to find those champions in our school board the first time around. And so by the time the funding was almost going to evaporate for those 2 projects, it was time to cut some corners. And so we had to kind of push things through in a way that I wouldn't advise people to do from this point on. Really, we involved social work to the point of which we invited them to presentations, but we didn't sit down with them and negotiate like how this was going to work. Neither did they ask, but I found that, we did things in a way that was a little rushed, but in hindsight, I probably wouldn't have done it any differently given the time that we were in. And so sometimes you just have to take that leap of faith. And the other thing is that the situation in our board of, where we are, our board, I mean, it's school systems, and maybe it's all systems and all sectors, the fear of doing something a little bit out of the box. And I think we're hoping to kind of inculcate a culture of risk taking, because actually in our schools now and in our curriculum, there's a huge emphasis for students to learn by taking risks, design thinking process. You try something, you learn from it, you adapt, and you try something new, and it's called iterative learning. So while we're trying to teach this to our students, I think we find it very difficult as adults who were raised in a very different system to really take that same approach in our work. When we see that things need to be tried, even though there is risk, the stumbling block still remains that if people aren't comfortable with the unknown or the fact that, okay, we're going to check off some boxes and get a result in 6 months or even sooner, if we don't become a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable around some of these steps that need to be taken, I feel like we're not going to get anywhere. And so it's constantly, I know during that whole project, I constantly had to remind people, this is a pilot. You know what that means, right? It means that we don't know everything. We don't know how this is going to work in a Canadian context. We are here to learn. We are going to make mistakes. And so that helps some people become a little bit more or a little less risk averse. But it was always, it was very obvious that, you know, everyone felt more comfortable with something that they had complete control over. And when you're doing a collaborative project and there's many other partners, there is no opportunity for complete control. So I think just continuously informing people about the needs and the challenges and the fact that to do nothing is really a risk, because we know students are already facing all of these things. So it's not so much an anecdote, but I guess really what I'm commenting on is the culture of risk aversion, while we're at the same time trying to teach our students that, you know, failing forward is okay, learning from that is okay. But it's going to take almost a generational shift, I think, because we were all raised to think you need to make sure everything's going to work out before you even embark on something. And I feel like that never gets you very far, because you're just never trying anything new.
Thank you so much. And I think that's such a good point, that the risk is also often already there for students. I know we wanted to have a good half hour for Q&A. I have one more question though that I really want to hear your answers to, so I'm going to eat up a little bit of that time. And so it's so hard sometimes to know when you're making a difference in this work. And I'm wondering if each of you could share, how do you know when you're making a difference? Can you think of a reflection or an instance where you realized you were making an impact through this work you're doing? And maybe we'll start with Monique again.
Sure. I think how we know we're making an impact or difference with the work that we're doing is from hearing the youth voice. So every year we have feasts and celebration to acknowledge the Indigenous student accomplishments and our Indigenous graduates in the school system. And before our actual feasting and event happens, students come up in front of a room full of people. They stand there and they provide I don't know if I want to call it a testimonial, but their story and how their involvement with NAWE has helped them to move through their secondary experience. So we hear these heartfelt stories from youth who are struggling to engage in school. They were struggling with attendance, with family issues, with housing issues, you know, all the social issues, and they stand up in front of us and they share how the program reconnected them to their culture, how their youth advisor supported them in all those areas that they needed, how the project gave them an opportunity to explore their identity as an Indigenous person, and how they have pride in who they are now, and how that program created an extended family network and support system for them, and where they're always accepted and held up. And often our students will say that if it wasn't for the program, they wouldn't have graduated high school, or they wouldn't have moved on to post-secondary. And many of our students move on to post-secondary with the goal of coming and working back in the community, which is really, really exciting. And we have students who have gone through our programs, completed post-secondary, and come back to work for NWASA. That's how much they believe in the project. And so, you know, we have someone who's done that and works as a youth advisor now, some that work in our culture and language departments, but also some that work in our early years. So it really is hearing those experiences and the youth voice, and constantly reflecting on, how are we being responsive to, the ever-changing and evolving needs of the youth that we serve.
That's amazing that you get to do that. I'm going to move on to Clovis, but I just want to also say that if folks have questions and they want to start adding them now, there's a place where you can add questions, and they can be for the whole panel, for one panelist, philosophical questions for no one in particular. Clovis, we'll go to you next.
For sure. Thank you. Two quick points. I think one, having representatives from the school board sit on our steering committee for the youth strategy was, for me, a great testimonial that there is partnership here, number one. And number two, the support of the superintendent who actually sits on that committee. I know in a number of our meetings, one meeting in particular, she invited two people while we were actually in the meeting to actually participate, because we were talking about a particular aspect of the board, and she says, let me just give a call and to my colleague, and she brought them into the meeting, and I thought, wow, that is buy-in, that is engagement, and so that for me was just a real testimonial that she really wants to see this succeed, and she wants her colleagues also to be engaged in doing this work. So that brought certainly a big smile to my face to see that.
Thank you. Yvonne?
So I'm going to speak about a collaborative example that I think kind of shows, again, what we've been talking about, which is the power of symmetry and time and everybody working on different aspects of a project. So my work has largely been around talking about raising awareness about poverty, income security, lack of employment opportunities, and housing security for young people and others. But my other colleagues have been very involved in work, and one colleague in particular for probably 10 years now has been very much taking up the torch on human trafficking in York Region, long before most people would say this was an issue, and we still have a lot of denial about that. And she began working with the YRP and with women's centers across the region because she wasn't getting any traction in the school. And I think there's often, as the ministry goes, as school boards go, there's certain topics that just don't become, I don't know what it is, okay to talk about for fear of, creating some kind of awareness that isn't healthy, but in no way, shape, or form was not having awareness about what was happening around human trafficking. And it's only escalated in the last 10 years. But due to the diligence and the persistence of my colleague who really drove this work, as well as with her community partners, and probably in combination with the work we were doing with 360 and trying to really raise, awareness of the region as being a place where, yes, things happen here. People get trafficked, people are homeless, people are losing their jobs and leaving and just having all kinds of difficulty. It's really come together in the last 2 or 3 years because the school board recognized, okay, this is a health and safety and a well-being issue. So there was a protocol and a committee that were established to just take this on and to look at how to embed awareness within our schools for our students, even with our parents. The parent part still ends up being done a bit more by the outside agencies, but I knew that this was actually really having an impact because just recently our superintendent that sits on the committees with the youth strategy talked about the Minister of Education reaching out to say, we've become aware of the good work that you're doing on human trafficking. We want to talk with you and potentially share that information across other school boards in the province. So I just remain convinced that a movement on any of these issues relates back to years of work on highlighting what the issues are that young people are facing and continuing to advocate for all sectors to have a role to play in that work. So that was a good moment because it wasn't my work, it was some of my work, but primarily other people's work. And I knew of how hard the slogging had been, and it resulted in something that everybody can be quite proud of the work, concerned about the issue, but very proud of the work that they've done.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. Charlotte, do you want to end us off?
Yeah, sure. I just want to say, to go with what you're all saying, Monique mentioned good intentions, and it's, you know, important to realize that we're going to make mistakes, but that we have good intentions, and that's so true. And we can't let like the mistakes we make prevent us from continuing the work, but also we can't just end at like, well, good intent, you know, I had the best intentions, so it's okay. And I'm not like saying that any of us are doing it here, but I have seen that where it's like, well, I had the best intentions, so, and I'm not going to necessarily acknowledge the harm that I've done. I think what's really cool about this is that we're sharing mistakes. I don't think that happens enough. And like Yvonne, you're talking about a culture of risk, and we have that, but we don't think about the risk that we take in not sharing our failures and acknowledging our failures and talking about the harms that we've done in the work that we intended to be good. And yes, we need to look for allies and understand that people have their places and that these are all different working parts of the solution, but we also can't wait for somebody else to make impact. I think in research, we often hope that our work will impact a policy or establish a policy, but you know, young people in my research have often pointed to bullying, the prevalence of bullying that they've experienced in schools, and the way that this has worsened their experiences of homelessness and led them to be pushed out or drop out of school. And when I was doing a policy scan of Ontario school boards, I found I was looking for homelessness. I was looking for a policy that would reference housing instability, and I didn't find one except for some minor ones around women and families fleeing abuse. But I found plenty on bullying, and so like young people in, you know, conversations we've had since then have pointed to this as proof that schools can't help in homelessness, because how can they help us in this if they can't even protect us from bullies? So is policy change even impact, even if our research does end up there? I'm not sure that it is. I think it's like Clovis is saying, like impact is in having those champions all over, because at the end of the day, textual policy only goes so far. We need people to actually care and to not just like understand this policy and implement it, but like to feel it and care about it, and, you know, live and breathe that policy and that culture of kindness and support in everything they do. So I also see, like, you know, sometimes people confuse activity for impact. So for me, impact isn't measured by the frequency or amount of activity we do, which can be highly performative, whether we mean it to be or not. You know, workshops, media engagements, websites, you know, publications. We can easily mistake action for impact. And another thing I've noticed is even in sectors that are sort of defined as helping sectors, we can see the most privileged people in those, or the most privileged entities, are capable of the most action. But in my opinion, they're also most likely to be blind to the lack of impact that action is having. For me, like, you know, impact, and you know, some people don't think you're doing impact unless you're engaging in collective action, unless you're disrupting. But for me, impact like happens on an individual basis as well. And I think that that's very powerful, especially when we think about the longevity of relationships and how much time it takes for things to actually change. Individual relationships and impact on individuals is very important. As far as the Chicken and Boots bursary goes, one thing that I really, obviously the first recipient just got awarded, and I just had a conversation with her yesterday, and she was telling me how much it meant to her. Which really made it feel real to me, you know, because sometimes we don't know if we're doing impact. It's hard to tell sometimes, am I being performative or am I doing something real here? Like, I don't even know, you know, and that was really like happy to hear about that, and how she felt comfortable when she saw the bursary and understood what it was. She, you know, she knew that when she walked on the campus that she could share what she was experiencing, and the warmth that she received from campus, because they were already prepped to be supportive of these individuals. And as I see it being shared, I see people sharing stories about Chicken and Boots, who were two young people who died whilst experiencing homelessness in Ottawa. I see some people just realizing, and this is 2 years after it's been established, just realizing that they've passed away, right? Like, to me, that's impact. It's so many young people die in homelessness, and it's so hard for us to keep their memories alive because we're all so disconnected. We're, you know, they're estranged from their families. We didn't get to go to their services. Things like that, to me, are impact. But I just think we all need to be conscious of you know, are we making impact or not? And it's okay to not be sure, and just acknowledging our mistakes.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And thank you so much, everyone. I've learned so much. I'm going to carry this all into my work, looking at homelessness in schools. And I think I might have to pass it off to Lindsay. Maybe we have some questions. But I just want to, again, thank you all for having this conversation. This is really important work.
Thanks, Jayne.
Okay, so we're going to transition into the Q&A period, and we've got 2 questions that have come in so far. One from Jimmy F, and the question is, what's the difference between school collaborations to minimize/mitigate negative impacts of housing insecurity and collaborations to advocate for increased public commitment to address root causes of housing insecurity? And are schools a useful potential partner for the latter?
Well, Jimmy gets the award for the best question because that takes into consideration a whole lot of factors. So I don't think the first part of that question, which is mitigating the impacts of housing insecurity, is something that we do. Typically in the education sector, I think there's a bigger role for us to play. And because I actually do a lot more work outside of my role as a school board in looking at collaborative ways to understand homelessness, not understand homelessness, understand what this housing crisis is about, that everyone is experiencing, that significantly impacts young people and other groups that have been marginalized. So I think there is a role for the school board. In fact, we're talking right now in York Region amongst a few partners. We know that young people in our schools want to address these issues. For far too long, the attempts at doing something around this were just a charity food drive, maybe some little exercise or play in a classroom to talk to students about it. I understand and appreciate that teachers are a little reticent to bring up these topics because they don't want to have any kind of negative impacts on their students. They fear that the stigma will be reinforced. But I think we have to get better at that, and we can do it at high school because we have lots of really students who want to take a lead on these issues. So we're looking at how we can involve high school students in the work outside of the school. So in the work that Clovis is doing, in the work that Blue Door is doing to retrain individuals who want to get back into the workforce, and the work that we're doing as a coalition to unearth the reasons why housing is such a crisis right now and why we need to make it a human right. So I think we have to, I don't think we want to wait for the school system to take this up. I think we want to find ways to engage either staff or students within the system itself to do the work on the outside so that they also elevate their thinking about what it is to create citizens that have a real knowledge and understanding and can make systemic change, not just talk about charity and oh, those poor people and all those kinds of things, because that drives me insane. So I think it's bringing people out into the real world so they can understand what is going on and get plugged into that work.
And if I can add, I think the school is, if I understand the question correctly, I would just point to the school not being the only player here, the school as a player, and even as we're looking at our youth strategy work, we're talking EMS, we're talking the police, we're talking the schools, we're talking shelters, you know, the gamut. So it's a way to create greater awareness about all the different touch points that we need to look at how all of us are actually interacting together to mitigate some of the issues that are at play when we're talking about youth homelessness. It's education, yes, for sure. But child welfare is a big player as well. We've got the police, they're a big player. You know, libraries. I mean, there are different players here, and so I think part of it is creating awareness, and through that we will get some of those champions who aren't. It's not just a school board, but there are other champions who can actually create that groundswell that can help create change. So. If it sounded like it was just the school, that wasn't the intent. It was that the school is an important player, especially since we know kids are mandated to be in school up until 18, at least in Ontario. But outside of that, there are a whole bunch of other players that have to be involved in this conversation as well.
Great.
There was
Thanks. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna, to be honest, I'm not necessarily understand the question, but to go like to Clovis's point about family reconnect, I did see an example in my research where a young trans woman when she was at risk of homelessness and going through her transition, her mother was very against that, and the school actually held this meeting. And it was a Catholic, I don't know why I'm saying that as if it's a shock. It's, I guess, because of stereotypes about religion, it's a shock. But this Catholic school rallied around this girl, brought her, they did a session with her mother. They did everything possible to do that family reconnect. And then when that didn't work, they helped her get housing. And they even changed all the bathrooms in the schools. And what I've heard, I don't know, you two would know if this is true. I've heard that a principal plays a big role in the culture of a school. So, and what happened for her is that she ended up having to leave that school, did end up going into homelessness. And when she returned to that school a year later, there was a different principal with completely different policies, not that same feeling at all. The gender neutral bathrooms had been replaced and things like that. Just as an example of mitigating impacts of homelessness.
Excellent. Did anyone else want to contribute to that response? Okay, we'll move on to a question from Cindy A. And this question is for Yvonne specifically, or Yvonne specifically. So Cindy is curious about your top 3 tips on securing the deep level of commitment to this type of work and furthering efforts to move from a culture of risk to a recognition/commitment that we must act differently and together. So top 3 tips.
Okay, top 3. Okay. Well, I think we've talked a lot about relationship building and really looking for those allies that then can leverage other allies in the school board. I think what I learned early on, I worked in and around schools for about 25 years before actually becoming someone who worked in a school board. And so there was a lot of this that was just completely outside of the realm of. So I think of all the things that I did to try and get the attention or kind of ingratiate myself and make some changes. And I was probably always missing the mark a little bit because what we have to do when we're trying to work with partners in different sectors is also find the angle from which they will understand and appreciate their role. So instead of saying, you need to do this, you find the way of communicating with them whether it's from a student health and well-being, equity and inclusion, from safety and a human rights perspective. And those things are becoming a lot more the talk of school boards, because we're starting to understand that students are whole people, that they have all kinds of needs and aspirations and challenges that they face. And so just getting a good education isn't enough anymore. And getting a good education doesn't happen for folks when they're dealing with a lot of other struggles. So we see more things happening in our schools than we have before. I shudder to think with that example, Charlotte, where they did actually move on including transgender or washrooms that anyone could use, and then they took them away. I mean, what the thinking has to be there is very concerning. But I think that when you can position something, and even within the school board ourselves, I mean, those of us who are trying to create change and trying to highlight systems, policies, things that actually are problematic, we have to find strategic ways to do that as well. And we can't do everything at once. I know within our board and other boards, transportation has become a huge problem and a huge cost. And there's been changes in that area from the last 10 years in terms of costs. And so we know we have students that can't even afford to get to school because somehow it's become their responsibility to pay to take transit to school. So we have to look at the issues from what is the education sector's role, and what is it that we're already doing? I always say we can't change everything outside of the school, but we can assess and use kind of a scan of those things that we feel are maybe perhaps putting our students at risk, and use a human rights and equity and inclusion lens with everything that we do, decisions, policies, programs. So I think we have to use that language. I know you wanted 3 top tips. I'll probably have to come back to you with that third one. I think all of what you've heard today is important. I find that sometimes the folks that are most amenable to this work are those that you don't often think of, and they're the folks that don't have as much sway, but they certainly are in the boards doing incredible work. And I think of CYWs and I think of social workers. And so when you can kind of go in those doors, it's not always obviously going directly to the director of education or to the superintendent. If you know someone who knows someone who works there that you can have a good conversation with, that's good as well. But a lot of our staff that are working directly with students who know those students really well, like our CYWs, they're always looking for innovative and helpful ways to support those students, and they can also become your champions as well.
Great. Thank you for that really robust answer. We've got a question from Lisha P. And Lisha writes, thank you all for this amazing conversation. I was wondering how you initiated the collaboration with schools. How did you approach a target school and persuade them to allow you to do youth homelessness prevention related activities? Did you use cold calls?
Well, I can say that when we started the Upstream project, we knew which schools were higher needs because we do collect the data. And so we approached schools that we also already had good relationships with the staff in those schools and knew that they wanted to do things. So certainly not cold calls, more based on, again, relationships and data.
I can share. So we didn't do a cold call. I think it was really a grassroots approach. We saw in our community that Indigenous students were struggling to attend school, really low graduation rates. And so the community came together with youth and parents and our local community foundation and the school boards to have a conversation about what would it look like for youth to have, and what, if any, supports they within the school. Sorry, I just heard lots of, and so it was through conversations and through an Indigenous Education Council that the creation of the program, the Nawe program, came to be. And it really has been that grassroots initiative based on youth need and also community contribution. And so when school boards have the opportunity to see that this isn't just an executive director of an organization or one person coming to them with an idea, but that an entire community and the youth voice is really lifting up this idea that they need these cultural, social, emotional, academic supports that are, that reflect their experience and their worldview embedded into the system. That's when they start to listen, right? And that's how we started to get those connections in, and our project started as a pilot project with funding from the Hamilton Community Foundation.
Right, did any of the other panelists want to join in on that? Okay, so we have a follow-up question from Alicia. So it looks like kind of, if you could share some specific tips about how you can get, or how you are currently getting, or how you can get stakeholders involved. And then one more question that I just don't want to get forgotten is Cindy is wondering if where you can find more information about the Upstream project. So if we could fit those two questions in, that would be great.
Can you repeat the first question?
Yeah. So specific tips about how to get stakeholders involved.
So I'll just offer one quick tip, and there's often in communities, not all communities, but there might be a social planning council or a social development council. There's 16 across Ontario, and so they are also doing a lot of work on the issues that we've been talking about. Even if it isn't directly only youth homelessness, they'll be working on housing and homelessness and income supports and that kind of thing. So they're often really connected with a lot of other partners in those areas to be able to strike up a conversation about who else could perhaps be interested in working on this together.
Clovis, you're muted. while Clovis is figuring out tonight, I'll just say that I've been approached recently by a few different projects and you know, wanting to engage various different stakeholders around issues around youth homelessness. But I think a bunch of times people have come to me after they've already got funding, and then they say things like, well, now we want to make sure this project is about gender diverse peoples, or that we're including you know, we have a real focus on Indigenous youth. And it's like, well, you haven't established the partnership and you've already gone too far. Like, I just want to emphasize that these partnerships need to be established like long before the money's in the bank, you know, like from day one, you need to be working on those relationships.
So I mentioned social planning, and if anyone has had any questions about the areas that they're calling from in Ontario in any way, if you email me, I can provide you information about that, because I work, I'm a co-chair of the Social Planning Council or Network of Ontario, so I can make connections with any of those councils or development councils across the province.
That's great. And there was a question that someone had about where they can learn more about the different projects that were alluded to today. So I shared where people can find more information about Upstream Canada. There's a link in the chat box or the questions box. But some of the other projects, are there places where people can learn more about that?
For NWASA, you can take a look at our website, www.niwasa.ca.
I also just, yeah, I wanted to invite people to check out the report at the link that Lindsay shared. It recently came out from Jackie Son and Stephen Gates, and highlights some of the new work happening around Upstream Canada, and actually speaks to a lot of these issues, and was the grounding for one of the blog posts that is part of this series and is really interesting.
We'll send or we'll make sure that we send an email out to everyone who is with us here today that has all of these links in case you weren't able to write them down. So you'll have access to the blog post, this report that Jayne just mentioned, and any other websites that are relevant. Clovis, did you get your microphone to work? I know you had something you wanted to say. No. Oh. Okay, well, I'm just looking at the time. Jayne, that's all the questions there are. So if you want to take back over.
Just quickly,
Yeah.
maybe we need to add 360 Kids website on there, because Clovis has a lot of great programs like the iGrad classroom and the Night Stop program that have been very successful and could probably be replicated for folks.
Absolutely. And I think in the blog post that you folks contributed to on the Homeless Hub as well, there are links out to different programs. So the scholarship that Charlotte's been talking about, Clovis's work, Monique, your work, Yvonne, I think there are links if you want to be learning more about these things. It's 2:30. I'm going to let you all free from this panel, but thank you so much. This was amazing. This is something that's so close to my heart, and I'm so happy to learn more about how this work is taking place, and looking forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks everyone.
It was fun.
Yeah.
We'll have to talk again soon.
See you on the next panel today, Charlotte.
Bye.
Bye.